Neuroplasticity is the brain's remarkable ability to change its structure and function in response to experience. But one of the most misunderstood ideas in modern neuroscience is the belief that neuroplasticity is passive or automatic. It is not. Neuroplasticity is earned. It is forged in effort, through repetition, and under pressure. The brain doesn't change just because we wish it to. It changes because we force it to by engaging in behaviors and environments that stretch our current capabilities. This is not metaphorical, it is biological. The synapses in your brain, those tiny connections between neurons, only become stronger and more efficient when they are activated with intensity and purpose. When you do something new or difficult or outside your comfort zone, your brain treats that experience as biologically relevant. Why? Because it perceives a mismatch between where you are and where you need to be to survive, succeed, or thrive. This mismatch signals the release of neuromodulators like norepinephrine, acetylcholine, and dopamine. These chemicals act as markers of importance, telling the brain, pay attention. This matters. It is in these states of focused attention and effortful practice that new circuits are wired or existing ones are refined. This is why repeating the same easy task over and over doesn't lead to growth. If the brain isn't challenged, it has no reason to rewire itself. It stays in a loop of efficiency, not evolution. Growth is not about doing more. It's about doing what is harder, what is unfamiliar, and what stretches the limits of your current neural circuits. For neuroplasticity to occur, you must engage in deliberate struggle. This means not just doing the thing you know, but pushing beyond what's comfortable repeatedly. That's where your magic or brain says, this is new. Let's build something better. People often ask how long it takes to change. There is no universal answer, but the brain doesn't work on a clock. It works on DAW's intensity of effort and WA's consistency of exposure. A deeply focused 30-minute session of learning under moderate stress, repeated regularly, is far more effective than hours of distracted or low-effort activity. The key is how engaged your nervous system is during the experience. If you are fully present, even short durations of practice can trigger profound changes in the brain. What's also critical to understand is that neuroplasticity is not equally available at all times. When you are calm and relaxed, your brain tends to reinforce existing patterns. When you are in a heightened state of focus, challenge, or even frustration, your brain is primed to change. This means the agitation and difficulty you feel while learning something new isn't a problem. It's the very condition required for transformation. The discomfort is a sign that you are at the threshold where the brain can be rewired. Neuroplasticity also works in both directions. If you constantly reinforce negative thought patterns, poor habits, or avoidance behaviors, those circuits become stronger too. The brain does not judge whether something is good or bad. It simply strengthens what is repeated with emotional intensity. That's why it's so important to be intentional about what you focus on and practice, especially when you're under pressure. What you do in those moments literally shapes who you become neurologically. This brings us to the crucial truth. You can force your brain to change, but it won't happen by accident. It requires intentional, effortful, and uncomfortable engagement with challenge. The more you expose yourself to constructive difficulty, the more adaptable your brain becomes. And over time, this builds what we call resilience, skill, and mastery. Not because you were naturally talented or motivated, but because you understood the biology. Neuroplasticity doesn't reward comfort. It rewards commitment. So when you feel resistance, remember this, that's your opportunity. That's the moment when your brain is listening the most. Don't waste it. Lean into it. And trust that with every repetition, with every difficult step forward, you are shaping a brain that is stronger, faster, and more capable. You are not waiting to become something new. You are actively building it, one synapse at a time. Stress is often misunderstood. It's usually cast as the villain, something to be avoided, managed, or eliminated. But from a neurobiological perspective, stress is not inherently negative. In fact, as moderate, well-regulated stress is one of the most powerful tools available for growth, learning, and adaptation. It activates systems in the brain and body that elevate alertness, increase focus, and trigger the release of key neuromodulators that prime the nervous system for change. When stress is approached and harnessed properly, it becomes a catalyst, not a curse. When you experience a stressor, Whether it's physical, emotional, or cognitive, your body responds immediately. Your heart rate increases. Breathing accelerates. The sympathetic nervous system activates. But what's happening in the brain is even more significant. Chemicals like as norepinephrine, also known as noradrenalines, and dopamine flood critical brain regions such as the prefrontal cortex and hippocampus. These chemicals are not random. They have purpose. Norepinephrine sharpens focus. It tightens your window of attention so that your brain prioritizes only the most important information. Dopamine enhances motivation and prepares your system to move forward toward a goal, even in the face of challenge. This internal chemical environment creates a highly plastic state, a temporary condition where the brain is more capable of forming new neural connections. In simple terms, a stress can make your brain more teachable, more able to update its models of the world, and build better strategies for handling complexity. This is why moments of challenge or uncertainty can be transformative if you learn to use the stress response rather than fear it. However, the type and duration of stress matter. As chronic, uncontrolled stress, the kind that lingers without resolution, can have damaging effects on both brain and body. It can shrink areas like the hippocampus, critical for memory, and weaken the immune system. But short bursts of acute, focused stress, especially when framed in a meaningful context, are biologically beneficial. They serve as signals to the brain that adaptation is needed. That's why elite performers, top learners, and high-functioning individuals don't avoid stress. They train with it. They build protocols to enter stress intentionally and exit it skillfully. Reframing your relationship with stress is crucial. Instead of interpreting elevated heart rate or anxious thoughts as signs of failure or danger, recognize them as Esser's neurobiological signals that your system is activated and ready to grow. That discomfort is not the enemy, it's the threshold. The brain is listening in those moments more intently than at rest. It is taking notes, encoding memories, analyzing errors, and preparing to rewire circuits based on the outcome of your actions. In learning environments, stress enhances memory formation. When a task is moderately difficult, the stress it induces increases the probability that your brain will encode the experience as significant. This is an evolutionary advantage. Our ancestors needed to remember how to navigate threats and challenges. The brain developed to remember what was hard and important, not what was easy and familiar. So, if you find yourself struggling to learn, that's a good sign. It means your brain is detecting a gap between your current abilities and what the environment demands. That gap is the invitation to level up. It's also important to recognize that as are voluntary stress exposures, when you choose to engage in hard things, is more adaptive than involuntary stress. When you place yourself in controlled, difficult situations, your brain develops resilience. It learns that stress is survivable, even useful. This builds what scientists call stress inoculation, a form of neural training where you increase your capacity to stay calm and focused under pressure. Over time, what once triggered anxiety becomes familiar, your brain adapts, your physiology stabilizes. Your threshold for stress increases. This is why people who consistently do difficult things, cold exposure, high-intensity training, deep focus work, often appear calm in crisis. Their nervous system has been trained through repeated, voluntary exposure to challenge. They've taught their brain and body that stress is not a stop sign, it's a green light for adaptation. The takeaway is the stress is not something to fear or avoid, it is something to work with. If you understand how it functions, if you learn to regulate your response and direct your attention during stress, you gain access to some of the most powerful mechanisms for transformation available in the human nervous system. Growth doesn't happen in safety and ease. It happens in the presence of difficulty, pressure, and uncertainty. So the next time you feel that wave of discomfort, tight chest, fast breathing, mental chatter, pause. Recognize what's happening. Your biology is not breaking down. It's waking up. It's preparing to build something new. And if you stay with it, guide it, and repeat it, you will not be the same person on the other side. Stress, when properly used, becomes the furnace in which strength, focus, and resilience are forged. There is a widely accepted myth that motivation must come first, that we need to feel inspired, energized, or mentally ready before we begin a difficult task or pursue a goal. But this idea is biologically inaccurate. From a neuroscience perspective, motivation is not a prerequisite for action, It is more often a result of it. Waiting to feel motivated before taking action is like waiting for your muscles to grow before you start training. The brain does not give you the energy to move forward by default. It generates that energy in response to movement itself. Motivation is closely tied to the neuromodulators dopamine, which plays a key role in regulating effort, reward, and forward movement. When we take action, especially when that action aligns with a goal or intention, the brain responds by releasing dopamine. This release reinforces the behavior and makes it more likely we will do it again. In other words, it's the doing that triggers the feeling, not the other way around. This mechanism is fundamental to human behavior and learning. It explains why starting is often the hardest part, but also why momentum builds once we do. One of the most effective ways to access this system is by taking even the smallest step forward. The brain is highly sensitive to change in state. When you shift from inaction to action, no matter how minor, you create a cascade of neural activity that begins to change how you feel. A simple act, like standing up, walking into a different room, or opening the tool you need to work with, can signal to your brain that you're entering a task-oriented mode. Once this shift occurs, focus begins to increase and dopamine starts to rise. The upward spiral begins, not because you felt like it, but because you moved. This is a central principle in behavioral neuroscience. AFAR's behavior can drive neurochemical states, just as much as neurochemical states can drive behavior. People who are successful in high-pressure environments, whether in athletics, military, business, or creative fields, understand this intuitively. They do not rely on how they feel in the moment to dictate what they do. Instead, they develop the discipline to act, knowing that the brain will catch up. By acting first, they engage the systems that eventually produce clarity, motivation, and energy. This is not to say that emotions don't matter or that mental states are irrelevant. Of course they are, but the idea here is that emotional states are often downstream of physical action and environmental cues. You can wait indefinitely for the perfect emotional setup, or you can prime your system by beginning. Your brain is constantly updating its prediction models based on what you do. When it sees that you are behaving as someone who is committed, capable, or curious, it begins to generate the internal chemistry that matches those actions. That's how identity shifts begin, through action, not contemplation. Additionally, the prefrontal cortex, the area of the brain involved in planning, decision-making, and self-control, is highly responsive to feedback from the body. When you engage in purposeful movement or even just start a task, this region becomes more active. This enhances your ability to maintain focus and suppress distractions. Action creates structure, and structure gives rise to productive internal states. It's a dynamic feedback loop between behavior and biology, and once you understand it, you are no longer a slave to motivation. Another crucial element is the timing of rewards. If you only allow yourself to feel good when a goal is fully completed, you miss many opportunities to engage your dopamine system along the way. Neuroscience shows that the dopamine system is most robust when we reward effort itself, not just the outcome. When you learn to associate satisfaction with the process, the mere act of showing up, trying, repeating, you create a self-sustaining cycle of motivation. Your brain begins to crave the challenge because it has learned that progress, not perfection, is what generates positive internal states. So when you feel resistance to starting something important, don't interpret it as a signal that you're not ready. Interpret it as the beginning of the cycle. Begin with whatever you can control: your posture, your breath, your first word, your first rep. Your biology is waiting for that cue. Once it arrives, the neurochemical systems of engagement and motivation will begin to activate. Not always immediately, not always dramatically, but reliably if you trust the process. In this way, you reclaim agency over your own neurochemistry. You are no longer at the mercy of moods or motivation. You become the one who initiates. And through that initiation, you train your brain to respond with the resources you need to continue. This is how progress is made. Not by hoping for inspiration to strike, but by striking the first spark yourself. Motivation is not the engine, it is the exhaust. And the engine is action. Discomfort is often misunderstood as a warning sign, something to be avoided or minimized. But from a neuroscientific perspective, discomfort is a zero-VAR's biological signal of growth. It marks the boundary between what is known and what is possible. when you feel discomfort, mental, emotional, or physical. Your nervous system is essentially telling you that you are in unfamiliar territory, which is exactly where change begins. The presence of discomfort is not a problem to be solved. It is evidence that your brain is preparing to adapt, to build new pathways, and to increase its capacity. When we engage in challenging tasks, the brain shifts into a state of heightened plasticity. This state is characterized by the release of certain neuromodulators like norepinephrine, acetylcholine, and dopamine. These chemicals play a critical role in helping the brain focus, encode information, and motivate forward movement. Discomfort, especially the kind that arises in situations requiring effort and persistence, is often the result of these neurochemicals pushing your system to pay attention and to adapt. You might experience it as restlessness, anxiety, agitation, or fatigue. But underneath those sensations, your brain is in a state of high receptivity to learning and change. This is why environments that are too easy or too comfortable do not promote real development. The brain needs signals of urgency to determine what is worth changing. If there is no challenge, there is no signal. If there is no signal, there is no change. Discomfort provides the friction that forces your system to build new solutions. Think of a muscle under tension. Without the resistance, there is no growth. The same is true for your mental, emotional, and behavioral circuits. They need to be challenged to be rewired. The key is learning how to interpret discomfort correctly. Most people are conditioned to view discomfort as danger. But in controlled, intentional settings, discomfort is a tool. When you feel it during a difficult learning session, a workout, or a moment of focused work, your brain is not telling you to stop. It's asking you to pay attention. It's asking, should I rewire? Should I allocate more resources here? Is this something I need to get better at? These moments are decision points. If you retreat, the brain reinforces avoidance. If you lean in, the brain opens the door to adaptation. It is also important to understand the timing of discomfort. In the early phases of any new challenge, discomfort is most intense. This is because your brain is unsure of how to respond. It lacks a neural model or template to guide the process. That uncertainty is stressful, but if you persist, if you continue to engage, even minimally, the brain starts to build models. It begins to recognize patterns. And with those patterns comes confidence, competence, and eventually mastery. But none of this can begin without first tolerating the discomfort that comes with not knowing. Discomfort is also tightly linked to error recognition and correction, which are fundamental to learning. When you make a mistake or encounter resistance, your brain releases signals that highlight the discrepancy between expected and actual outcomes. These signals create the tension that drives learning. It is uncomfortable, yes, but it is also the process by which the brain updates itself. Each error, each failure is like a marker that says, here's where improvement is needed, and the emotional discomfort that comes with it ensures that the lesson is remembered. Your brain encodes the experience more deeply because it mattered. It was hard. It left a mark. But you must stay with it long enough for the adaptation to occur. Many people quit just before the brain begins to change. They interpret discomfort as a fixed limit rather than a temporary state. But those who can sit in the discomfort, those who understand that this is exactly when the rewiring is happening, gain an advantage. They are able to transform temporary pain into lasting progress. They are the ones who turn effort into excellence. This doesn't mean you should pursue pain for its own sake. It means you should develop the ability to differentiate between destructive pain and constructive discomfort. The latter is where transformation lies. It is not dangerous. It is necessary. It tells you where your limits are and invites you to move past them. If you embrace it, use it, and stay with it, you train your brain to become more resilient, more adaptable, and more capable of change. In the end, discomfort is not something to escape. It is something to work with. It is the signal that your nervous system is alive, attentive, and engaged. It is the bridge between who you are and who you are becoming. When you feel it, don't run. Don't numb it. Don't interpret it as weakness. See it for what it is, your biology telling you that growth is happening right now. Consistency is often underestimated, especially in a world that celebrates intensity, speed, and dramatic transformation. But from a neuroscience perspective, consistency is the single most reliable driver of long-term change in the brain. The nervous system does not change based on how intense your effort is once in a while. It changes based on repeated signals delivered over time. Each time you engage in a behavior, practice a skill, or face a challenge, your brain receives input. If that input is consistent, the brain recognizes it as valuable and begins to reallocate resources toward making that pattern more efficient, automatic, and long-lasting. This process is rooted in what neuroscientists call Hebbian plasticity. Neurons that fire together, wire together. What this means is that when you repeatedly activate certain neural pathways, the connections between those neurons become stronger and more efficient. But it doesn't happen instantly. Just like muscles need repeated stimulus to grow stronger, neural circuits require repeated activation over time. If you engage in an activity only occasionally or sporadically, your brain interprets it as noise, not a priority. But when you show up daily, even for short periods, the signal becomes clear. The brain begins to allocate attention, memory, and metabolic resources to that behavior. That's how habits are formed and skills are built. What's even more fascinating is that the brain is always scanning for patterns of repetition. Even when you're not aware of it, every behavior you engage in regularly becomes part of your neurological identity. Whether it's waking up and training, sitting down to focus, or pushing through difficult moments, the repeated act sends a message. This is who I am. Over time, this becomes embedded not just in your psychology, but in your biology. Your neurons wire in such a way that your default settings begin to reflect the behaviors you've practiced most. This is how change becomes sustainable, not by motivation alone, but through consistent exposure. Moreover, as consistency helps regulate the brain's prediction systems. The human brain is fundamentally a prediction machine. It is constantly forecasting what will happen next based on past inputs. When your behaviors are consistent, your brain can predict what's coming and prepare the appropriate physiological and cognitive responses. This leads to greater efficiency, less resistance, and a smoother execution of tasks. But when your efforts are scattered, the brain experiences each new attempt as a novelty, which consumes more energy and generates more internal friction. Consistency removes this unpredictability and allows the brain to automate and optimize your actions. One of the most profound effects of consistency is on dopaminergic tone, the baseline level of dopamine available in your system. When you engage in regular, goal-directed behaviors and see small signs of progress, your brain rewards you with steady dopamine signaling. This doesn't just make you feel good, it strengthens your desire to keep going. In contrast, inconsistent effort leads to inconsistent dopamine responses, which undermines motivation. If the reward signal is unreliable, the behavior becomes less appealing over time. But when your brain learns that effort leads to reward, even a small one, it locks in the behavior as valuable. Consistency also trains the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for planning, decision-making, and focus. When you commit to a consistent routine or behavior, this region becomes more active and begins to strengthen its connections with other parts of the brain. As a result, your ability to delay gratification, manage distractions, and stay on task improves. This is why consistent routines are not just helpful, they are neurologically transformative. They sculpt the architecture of your brain in ways that make sustained focus and effort more accessible in the future. Another powerful aspect of consistency is that it creates a feedback loop between action and identity. When you consistently act in alignment with your goals, your brain begins to update its internal model of who you are. You start to see yourself differently, not just as someone who wants change, but as someone who creates it. This shift in identity leads to more aligned behaviors, which further reinforce the new identity. Over time, you are no longer trying to become disciplined. You are disciplined, not because you said so, but because your brain has been trained through repetition. Importantly, consistency does not mean perfection. The nervous system does not require flawless execution to adapt. What it needs is repetition over time with intentional effort. Missing a day, facing setbacks, or making mistakes does not undo progress. What matters is that you return, that you stay in the loop, that you keep showing up. The cumulative effect of thousands of small, consistent actions is what rewires the brain. It's not the flash of brilliance, but the steady beat of effort that transforms potential into performance. In the end, consistency is not about being the best today. It's about being better tomorrow and the day after and the day after that. It's a quiet, powerful force that leverages the brain's natural systems for adaptation. It is the mechanism by which chaos becomes clarity, effort becomes ease, and goals become reality. When you understand the biology of consistency, you no longer see it as boring or mechanical. You see it as the engine of change. Not dramatic, but dependable. Not instant, but inevitable. And in the brain, that kind of signal is the one that always gets through. One of the most profound discoveries in neuroscience over the past several decades is that the human brain remains thasis and plasticas, capable of change throughout life. This neuroplasticity is not limited to childhood or early adulthood. It is a continuous, dynamic process by which the brain reorganizes itself in response to experience, environment, and effort. But what's often overlooked is that as you can direct this plasticity deliberately, the brain doesn't just change by accident. It changes based on what you pay attention to, what you repeat, and how intensely you engage with your environment. This means that no matter where you are in life, your nervous system is still capable of being rewired if you give it the right inputs. Neuroplasticity works on the principle of demand and supply. The circuits that get used frequently are strengthened, while those that go unused begin to weaken or fade. If you constantly practice distraction, your brain will get better at being distracted. If you routinely practice discipline, focus, or problem solving under stress, your brain will reinforce those abilities. This is why it's critical to be intentional with your behavior. Every day, you are training your brain, whether you realize it or not. The only question is, what are you training it to become? Central to this process is the concept of deliberate neuroplasticity, the idea that you can create change in the structure and function of your brain through consistent, focused, effort-driven behaviors. This is different from passive learning or casual experience. For true rewiring to occur, there needs to be intensity and relevance. The brain must detect that what you're doing is important enough to warrant structural change. That detection happens through the release of specific neuromodulators like R's acetylcholine, which enhances focus and encoding, and R's norepinephrine, which flags events as salient or significant. These chemicals create a learning window where plasticity is heightened. During this window, the brain is more susceptible to building new connections or altering old ones. However, simply knowing that the brain can change is not enough. You must also understand how to guide that change intentionally. One of the most effective ways to do this is by pairing focused attention with repetition. Focus tells the brain where to direct resources, and repetition tells it what to prioritize. This is why multitasking inhibits learning. When your attention is scattered, the brain gets a weak, diluted signal and doesn't register it as meaningful. In contrast, sustained attention on a single, effortful task, done repeatedly, creates the conditions necessary for real rewiring. This applies across all domains of performance: mental, emotional, physical, creative. Whether you're trying to learn a new language, build emotional resilience, or master a physical skill, the same principle holds. What you do repeatedly under focused attention changes your brain. This is the mechanism by which people rebuild themselves after trauma, recover from setbacks, or develop new capabilities in midlife or later. It's not about age, it's about input. Another important factor in driving neuroplastic change is feedback. The brain needs to know whether its efforts are leading to desired outcomes. This is where error signals and correction loops come into play. When you try something and fail, your brain flags the discrepancy between expected and actual outcomes. If you then correct your course and try again, the new behavior gets reinforced. Over time, the brain starts to prefer the corrected behavior. But if you avoid feedback or stop after failure, the brain encodes avoidance instead of improvement. So, leaning into feedback, even when it's uncomfortable, is critical for rewiring your brain in a productive direction. In addition, emotional saliency. How much something matters to you can dramatically enhance neuroplasticity. When an experience has deep emotional meaning, the brain tags it as high priority. This is why goals connected to personal values, identity, or purpose are more neurologically powerful than abstract or superficial ones. If you care deeply about your transformation, your brain listens more closely. Your nervous system commits more fully to the task. The intensity of emotional engagement can literally amplify the brain's capacity to learn and change. It's also crucial to understand that S-plasticity is a double-edged sword. The brain will adapt to anything you do repeatedly, even if it's unhealthy, unproductive, or self-limiting. If you rehearse negative thoughts, avoidance, procrastination, or impulsivity, you will get better at those things too. So being passive about neuroplasticity is not an option. It will happen whether you guide it or not. The opportunity is in learning how to use it deliberately to shape your mind and behavior in ways that serve your goals. Ultimately, the message is empowering. You are not fixed. Your identity, your habits, your cognitive strengths and weaknesses. These are not permanent traits. They are reflections of patterns that your brain has reinforced over time. But patterns can be changed. With intention, repetition, and the right kind of effort, you can literally reshape the circuits that define how you think, feel, and act. You are the architect of your own brain, not in a metaphorical sense, but in a biological one. Neuroplasticity is not just a feature of the brain, it is the very mechanism by which transformation becomes possible.